I think all of us know that there is dire poverty in the world, hundreds of millions of people, though this awareness seems to have faded into the background as our attention pivots from one immediate crisis to the next. What most don't know is that substantial progress has been made in the field of international development, economic growth, and reduction of poverty in nearly all countries. In this presentation, I aim to summarize extreme poverty in the world and progress that's been made in reducing it, provide a capsule history of foreign aid, how it's evolved together with foreign investment to help eliminate poverty and improve living conditions, explain the current global effort to radically reduce dire poverty by 2030, and elaborate prospects and continuing problems and issues with poverty alleviation. How do we define what is dire poverty? Generally, it's much worse than what we know in the United States as poverty. I'll start by saying that there is an international financial benchmark to define dire poverty, although it's very contentious. It's about $6,500 per year for a family of four. The problem is that most people who are desperately poor don't actively participate in the financial system. If they're in a rural area, they'll have their own land, they'll subsistence farm. Otherwise, they may barter or trade. So the majority of economists are not really happy with that measure. But what is agreed upon are the conditions of poverty that affect those who are desperately poor. So we're talking about millions of people in a country or a region who have little or no access to health care. Here in the United States, we have about one physician per 400 people. In parts of Asia and Africa, it's one physician per 4,000 or 5,000 people. High infant mortality and adult morbidity. You typically have families of 5 or 6 children with 1 or 2 dying before the age of 5, life expectancy between 40 and 50. Lack safe, potable running water and toilets. No access to electric current. Eat 1 or 2 local crops for food, often malnourished. Many are illiterate, not attending school beyond primary grades. Women are often consigned to bearing many children and staying at home. And many live in ramshackle housing. It's generally considered that people living with 4 or 5 or 6 of these conditions are desperately poor. One photo of dire poverty. This might be the 10th circle of hell. Here you have an urban slum. This could be in any one of 50 or 60 countries. People come to the cities from the rural areas because they are overcrowded. There is no work, and they do what they can to subsist in the city. That all being said, there has been considerable progress. We'll take a while to look at these numbers. You see, the world population has increased significantly from 1990, 5.3 billion to 7.9 billion. The numbers of people in dire poverty have decreased. So you see in 2021, the numbers of people in poverty have gone up, and that's due to COVID. This is a very rough estimate. But in 2019, the percentage of the world population living in terrible conditions had decreased to about 13%. When I gave this talk on a pilot basis, one question is, well, how would conditions in the United States relate to that? Well, the information is researched for all countries. And according to the World Bank, in the United States, 1.2% of the population is estimated to live this way. In Canada, it's much less, 0.2%, and in Sweden, 0.4%. I would say that in parallel, this is more or less consistent with the estimate of homelessness in the US, which according to published data is about 0.5%. How have these improvements overall affected humanity as a whole? Well, the decrease of people in dire poverty from 2 billion in 1990 to 1 billion in 2019. For all the people on Earth, these are averages. Average life expectancy increased from 65 to 71 years. Access to safe, convenient water supply expanded from 75% to 89%. Access of people to electricity and electric power grid increased from 71% to 87%. Now, these high percentages look good, but it still means over 1 billion people without these accoutrements. The share of global population suffering from acute malnutrition decreased from 19% to 11%. The infant mortality rate fell from 65 deaths to 29 deaths per 1,000 live births. Infant deaths decreased from 8.7 million to 4 million per year. The ratio of girls to boys in primary schools increased from 86% to 97%. Foreign aid. I consider foreign aid a concrete expression of humanity caring for and attempting to better itself, a spark to help enable human and economic development, while each nation is ultimately responsible for its own development. So foreign aid is currently, or say in the last 3 or 4 years, about $300 billion per year. Offhand, it sounds like a lot, but it's about $200 per person living in dire poverty. And that's not a great deal. So we'll get to how this works. So first, talk about the beginnings of foreign aid. It started around the mid-1950s. This scene here is from the cover of a World Bank staff magazine in around 1956. So it's not as if people had thought this out that carefully, but basically, first, people thought these very poor countries need the basics, at least a start. They need electricity, they need safe water supply, ports, roads, schools, and let's just do it. A second major concern was to alleviate and prevent further famine as populations were rapidly expanding. In the mid-50s, they knew the population would zoom up. And in the mid-50s, there were famines. And nowadays, people ask, well, why weren't we more concerned about the environment 30 or 40 or 50 years ago? The reason is the primary concern was, will we have enough food on Earth? So that led to what was called the Green Revolution. And this was among the first successes, well, you might say one of the few almost complete successes in foreign aid and development. You had a group with a rather bureaucratic sounding name, the World Bank Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. And this is ongoing, it hasn't stopped. They funded the establishment of 14 agricultural research stations, each one in a developing country, that focused on improved planting and yields of rice, wheat, maize, potatoes, tropical fruits, and arid agriculture. For most of these crops, in part due to genetically modified organisms, yields increased by 4 to 7 times. And that's one reason why the specter of famine has been virtually eliminated. When it occurs now, it's usually due to gross negligence in the countries where it happens. So I'll tell you about the World Bank. It was established in 1945. I call it a peaceable United Nations, comprised of 189 countries. The bank has a board representing the member countries. They don't engage in histrionics. It's very businesslike. The bank provides about $90 billion per year in development aid out of the 300 billion that's given. It recommends development policies and approaches. It serves as a global clearinghouse for data on national economies and living conditions. Its original role was to aid in the reconstruction of European and Asian countries after the Second World War. It began to assist developing countries in 1952. The primary goal of the institution to eliminate dire poverty was adopted in 1973. So also asked in the pilot presentation was, where does World Bank money for development aid come from? Where did they get these billions of dollars? Well, the World Bank sells its own bonds in global capital markets. It uses that capital to make low interest loans to more advanced developing countries like Mexico and Poland. Actually, the bank also makes loans to Russia and China. You might think, well, China doesn't really need the money, which is true, but China appreciates the expertise that comes with those loans. The bank's aid is simply not parceled out helter-skelter. Every project is specifically designed to help impoverished people in whichever country, and China still has many impoverished people. The bank applies the net income from loans to the more prosperous developing countries to cover its operating expenses, and it applies that and contributions from high-income countries also, about $30 billion per year, to aid the very poorest countries in the world with either grants, no interest loans or loans at 1% interest. Other major sources of foreign aid for poverty alleviation, these numbers are pre-COVID. The U.S. Agency for International Development, which provides about, well, in a range of 40 to 60 billion. There's some uncertainty because some of those loans or grants are not exactly for poverty alleviation. It's more politics, but it's at least 40 billion per year. Great Britain, 20 billion, Japan, 16, France, 11 billion, China, 7 billion. Then in the private sector, the largest is the Gates Foundation, which provides about $6 billion in aid per year. And I show CARE, just as an example, with about $600 million in aid per year, which is funded by private contributions. Now, for COVID, over and above what I just elaborated, another $100 billion has been granted to poor countries since April 2020. About 50 billion has come from the World Bank from a reserve set aside for such unforeseen emergencies, and about 50 billion from governments. A problem is that just because the money is there doesn't mean it can be spent immediately. There are issues with procurement and, of course, availability of vaccines and supplies. How foreign aid ignites development. So as I said, foreign aid has amounted to about $200 per person per year. And how it's worked has been as such. The idea first was to provide basic infrastructure to poor countries to enable some growth. As I said, electricity, safe water, transport, educational, and medical facilities, not for the whole country, which would be unaffordable, but for at least a small area of an impoverished country. Then business and free enterprise are encouraged. Countries establish a climate welcoming to both foreign and local business investment, evoking confidence in a welcoming environment with long-term stability. Then investment begins to be made, establishing manufacturing facilities and more recently other business services like call centers. Going back 15 to 20 years, we had horror stories of bad working conditions in these plants, which was true, but over time, very slowly, these have been improved. Then as you get more economic activity in a country, the country will begin to flourish as economic activity grows and ultimately diversifies. Opportunities broaden, incomes rise, tax revenues increase to the governments, enabling expanded education, health, and welfare services. The photo here is of manufacturing facilities in Vietnam. Vietnam has become a major exporter because foreign investors have been welcomed there. And nowadays, when you buy athletic shoes or quality clothing, there's a good chance it has been made in one of these plants. Now, what has happened here was not planned. It just happened initially in the countries that were called the Asian tigers, like South Korea and Taiwan. And now other countries have been emulating it. So in sum, in addition to the $300 billion in annual foreign aid, foreign business investment in manufacturing, services, energy, agriculture amounts to $1.5 trillion per year, or about $1,000 per poor person. There have been many changes in development practice. Around 1982, 1992, there was a shift from mostly hard infrastructure, from roads, ports, electricity, to investment in health, education, and the environment. And these were done in a way that they were affordable so that the developing countries could copy them. Another change was that the World Bank and other providers of foreign aid had been reluctant to set conditions for granting aid, and they adhered to a policy of non-interference. But this changed because in many countries, progress appeared to be stalled, and you had many violators of human rights, and the aid flowed nevertheless. Then at the same time, China introduced free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping, invited foreign investment, joined the World Bank. Russia and other former Soviet states did. And at the same time, the World Bank and other providers of foreign aid began to set conditions. So no aid projects unless the surrounding environment is cared for, unless there is gender equity in project design and implementation, and increased anti-corruption measures. There's always been international competitive bidding in these projects, but it was strengthened, and the World Bank established a large anti-corruption wing with about 100 investigators. There's a global hotline to report corruption. Not that this always works, but there are now some enforcement mechanisms. If there's criminal activity, it's referred to the country itself. If it has to do with corruption, say, among contractors, the World Bank and other organizations will blacklist them so they cannot participate in further activities of this sort. Women in development, a vital factor in breaking the cycle of poverty. One reason why people continue to have many children in poor countries is to ensure that some would survive. And as an extension of that, work for women almost exclusively meant caring for children at home. At the same time, high population growth retards economic development because fewer resources are available for incremental economic and social investment. In successful development experience, improved healthcare reduces the desire to have large families, with the assurance that most children will survive. Foreign and local investment provides work opportunities for women outside of the home. Family income increases, population growth slows, easing pressure on social funding, land, and the environment. And women come to have some freedom of opportunity and choice about family and career. So why nations develop at different paces? There's all kinds of reasons. It's not been possible to quantify these. But historically, countries located at a geographic juncture that would encourage trade and commerce, like the Mediterranean Sea, have developed first. culture encouraging business enterprise and investment, culture encouraging education, equality of opportunity for women and girls, lower population growth, tolerance of different lifestyles and religions, absence of ethnic strife, governance protective of human rights. Well, on that, China does not rank high, but nevertheless, it ranks high in many other factors. So China has developed very fast nonetheless. Oil and other desired natural resources are, of course, a big help, although it has its downside as well. So these are some examples of what more or less are considered success stories in economic development. You have the per capita income per person in this range of countries. So South Korea was an initial success story. If this were to be brought back to 1970, for South Korea, it would show maybe $300 and a tremendous increase in per capita income, which is not greatly unequitably distributed. It's partly cultural. So Botswana and Cote d'Ivoire have been success stories in Africa. In Cote d'Ivoire, you see it fell, the per capita income fell in 2000. That reflected the terrible civil war they had, but that has ended and the country is on a positive path. You can see that China has done well. There's been some doubt about statistics coming from China. Some say that the high numbers are exaggerated, but in any case, there's no question that China has done extremely well. India doesn't appear to have done as well as China, not by a long shot, according to the numbers. But India has made substantial progress in reducing dire poverty. And then you have the average for the world, counting everybody. Now, I need to note that these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. The numbers to adjust for inflation are simply not there for 1980 for many countries. For the year 2000, they have the numbers for the world average. So that $5,504 per year, adjusted for inflation, it would be about $7,800. So in real terms, the average global income per person has increased from about 7,800 to 11,400 in 2019. So I had shown you a picture of a terrible slum. I should divert for a moment to show what's being done about that. What has come to be best practice, and there have been many World Bank sponsored and other USAID sponsored projects along this line. Best practice has been not to move people out, but to encourage the residents to stay where they are, to deed them ownership of the little land that they occupy, grant them the funds and means of erecting permanent dwellings with requisite infrastructure, electricity, and plumbing. So this is a result. This was a project in progress. It's very crowded, but you can see people have individualistic homes and have sense of difference and a residence. Recent efforts and best practices. Recently, in the last 7 years, there's been an emphasis on more equitable income distribution within developing countries, including individual project design and tax policies. The World Bank and other organizations are now providing aid. Specific projects aim to provide broadband throughout all developing countries. There's been a reduction of government subsidies and price controls when practical that typically helped city dwellers but badly hurt farmers. So I need to explain this. In many developing countries, especially dictatorships, you had a situation where the people in charge knew that to stay in power, they had to at least keep people in the cities happy. So food was heavily subsidized, but it meant that farmers in the rural areas had a disincentive to grow food. And they would gradually grow less food, and then the countries would become dependent on foreign food aid. But the leaders would stay in power because food was priced inexpensively. So that's been coming to an end, although people had to move carefully, because if you raise prices very fast, people in the cities couldn't afford it and they would riot. But that's being dealt with. And as developing countries became more prosperous, they began to give cash grants to the poorest citizens. It was pioneered in Brazil, Mexico, and India. India has a very successful nationwide program. So the poorest of the poor receive monthly cash grants. They are unrestricted. In other countries, sometimes the grants are conditional. In certain rural areas, people would not send children to school because they needed them to work the land. So these grants take up that need so the children can go to school. So there is a program in place to end all extreme poverty by 2030. It most likely will not be achieved, but I think they'll come close. I have to say that much of the progress that I've shown up to 2019 occurred in India and China, which have about a third of the world's population put together. Progress in other parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America has been uneven. Some problems include continuing statism, bureaucracy, corruption, and gender equality and economic participation of women is not improving as rapidly as would be needed to end extreme poverty in some countries. There's continuing high population growth, especially in Africa. The population growth has not come down as quickly as hoped. And now, at last, global warming, in particular desertification, the drying of arable land, and also rising oceans, is slowing progress, especially in North Africa and Bangladesh. Another factor is the emigration of skilled professionals from developing to developed countries. One problem with healthcare is that physicians, nurses, and other medical staff who are schooled in developing countries at some cost will ultimately emigrate to developed countries, and you cannot fault them. The compensation is much better. Conditions are much better, but it is a problem. And then, of course, you have failed and failing states like Syria and Venezuela. One serious conundrum, electric power for Africa. Most sub-Saharan African countries are doing fairly well in growing their economies. Nevertheless, out of a population of 1,300,000,000, about 500 million Africans do not have access to electric current. Daily brownouts occur in most African capital cities. What Africa would like are coal-fired generating plants, which are now environmentally taboo. But they appear to be the easiest, fastest, and least expensive way to remedy this, especially in poor countries. There is development of solar energy. It's happening, but it's relatively costly and could not hope to provide for very large urban populations. It is working in rural areas. So international aid providers and Europe and the United States balk at any foreign aid or investment in coal-fired plants. The last World Bank loan for coal-fired plants in Africa was about 8 years ago, and it was very contentious. Under the Trump administration, the United States voted for it. Now the United States would not. So at the moment, only China is assisting African countries to build new coal-fired electricity generating plants. So here I show a longer view from what I had shown before. So you can see over the last 70 years, almost a century, the number of people in dire poverty has decreased from 70% to about 13%, or as of 2019. What will happen in 2030? The world population is estimated at 8.8 to 9 billion. Now, of whom in dire poverty, 600 to 800 million. That's my estimate, taking into account COVID. The World Bank estimates about 4% now. I think that's a bit optimistic, but in any case, significant progress has been made and is being made and will be made. Here you have a view of the very long arc of history, liberation from lives nasty, brutish, and short. You've got 1820, where the population of the earth was only about 1 billion, but most lived in very bad conditions. Of course, at that time, you had no electricity, a very little semblance of quality medical care. And you see how the global population has increased in the green line, and the reddish brown indicates the numbers of people in dire poverty. So over time, progress has been made, and there is hope